Hello, and welcome back to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast. On today's episode, we are talking all about retraining your brain. Yes, you can retrain your brain, and many chronic conditions, infections, diseases, pain patterns are actually due to malfunctions in the brain connections. My guest today is an internationally renowned speaker, filmmaker, and health practitioner who has dedicated his life to supporting people through chronic illness and achieving their potential. He's published several medical papers and is continually researching several different chronic conditions, and he has created a neuroplastic recovery program known as the Gupta Program in 2007. We talk a lot in this episode about all the different ways that actually conditions start. Like, how do they begin, physical or emotional? Where do they start in the brain? Because our brain connects everything and it controls everything. And so when we're looking for root causes of what's going on in our body, we have to consistently go back to the brain and what is it doing? Because our brain only cares about survival. So a lot of symptoms and things we are experiencing is because of faulty brain connections and patterns. So this episode is super important. It's super powerful. I think it's a part of health that people don't really get into until they've exhausted all other measures of physical health. And really, I mean, it's probably one of the most important things because your thoughts, your mind, how your brain works, controls everything, and it's so powerful. We hope you enjoy this message today. Go ahead and take a look if you're interested in the program. It's called www.guptaprogram.com. Lots of resources on there to start the brain retraining process if this method works for you. And please please share, please comment, support this podcast. It's viewers and listeners like you that make this go, because this is all volunteer-based. So please share, like, comment. It may change someone's life, this information. It may change their health and their body. And so all that we ask is that you please do those things so that we can get this message to the masses and help as many people as possible, which is our vision and our goal. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
What do you do to take care of yourself?
Welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast with Dr. Rachel Hamill.
I ain't Dr. Phil. I'll truly help you heal your mind.
Connect with alternative medicine innovators that will challenge and empower you.
It has the potential to change your whole life.
Create natural balance for both your body and mind.
Your health is very important.
All while uncovering the truth behind modern medicine.
This is crucial.
It's raw, it's real, and it's unfiltered. Here's your host, Dr. Rachel.
Well, Ashok, what an honor it is to have you on today. Welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. Lovely to be here with you.
Yes, so nice to meet you virtually. And I know in the alternative medicine world, which is what I'm currently in a lot of the communities for like Lyme disease, for mold, your programs that, you've developed have quickly become very well known. For good reason. And, through this process, you've helped so many people overcome from very difficult health conditions by retraining their brain, as you discuss, and we will discuss today. For those who have heard you, but maybe really don't know you, or maybe for those who are hearing you for the first time today, I'd love if you begin telling us just a little bit about the mastermind behind the process, because I think it's just important for people to know, that many who are doing big things in this field who are just in this field is because we ourselves overcame, some type of hardship and we fought for that knowledge. And I know your story is very similar.
Yes, like many of us who are in this field, we've come from our own challenges, our own health challenges. And I myself, in the mid-90s, suffered from ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. And in those days, these things weren't particularly recognized. And so there wasn't much help. And I essentially had this deep chronic fatigue, and I went from doctor to doctor, and they said, we don't know what you have. We don't even know what to call it. There's no treatment for it, and you might have it for the rest of your life, and there's nothing we can do. And you can imagine for a young man, this was like it was like a death sentence. Like, what are you telling me? You don't even understand what I have. And yet it's incredibly debilitating. And that started my lifelong quest to understand these conditions. And I remember in my darkest moment, I'd met lots of other people who suffered from this. And I said, if I can just get myself well, I will, really do whatever it takes to heal as many people as possible, because there is so much untold suffering. And so I managed to get myself 100% better with some brain retraining and ad hoc that I kind of created myself, got myself 100% well, and then went on to create a clinic to treat others, and then published a medical paper on the subject as well in 2002. And then since then, we've been doing medical trials. We've been obviously pushing the treatment out there, and with the aim of just getting people better. That's why we're here. And it's been a real journey for me, and it's been a humbling journey, because you think you've got to a certain stage, and then there's other things you need to understand, and not everyone responds to a treatment. So we've been working extremely hard in those 20 years to really make this as effective as possible for the vast majority of people. And it's been a real joyful journey.
Yeah. And during that time initially, you were in school. You probably weren't studying like necessarily these things, or did you have an interest in, the brain before you started to learn, mostly out of a necessity? Did you have any interest in the brain? Like, what were you doing before?
I did have an interest in psychology, for sure.
Okay.
And certainly some aspects of spirituality, I wasn't particularly developed along that in terms of my own journey. But I had some interest in that, I think, in psychology. And that kind of helped me fathom what was going on, the kind of juncture, because we often separate psychology and neurology, and then we're going to separate immunology over here and pain over here. But actually, we're one integrated system. So for someone to be an effective practitioner, they have to actually study all the disciplines together to understand the crossovers and the synchronicities that enable us to be able to heal at a holistic level. So I think I had those interests.
Now, looking back, because it's easy to look back now out of the fog of all of that, but now looking back at, to what has been accomplished and what's been utilized, do you now kind of look at that season of your life differently? Do you look at it, as a blessing? Because really it like pushed you into your calling. Like, how do you view that season of your life now where you're at?
Oh, I think for many years I've seen it as a changing point. You see, human beings, we naturally put things into two buckets, good or bad. And I believe that at a deeper level, there's a third bucket which incorporates both, which is growth. That actually as human beings, our mind wants to have the good and reduce the bad. But as far as our soul is concerned, I believe it's about growth, that we choose to grow and expand and learn more about ourselves. And therefore, growth involves good and bad experiences, or what we would call bad. And therefore, I look back on that, I think it was the worst period of my life, but in some ways the best period of my life, because it helped me understand more about myself. I became a transformed person, and go through my heartache, I was then able to go on and help thousands of others. So it is all about the perspective that you take. And sometimes we can't see those perspectives when we're in the depths of despair and we're in the middle of those experiences. And that's where faith and trust comes in.
Yeah, 100%. Adversity definitely propels us, good and bad, to where we need to go, and it pushes us. And I'm under the same belief. I suffered as a young person for many years that propelled me into this as well. So you just take it, you look back and you go, oh, wow, all of that was really a setup for what I'm doing. So you can propel it in that way. It's so powerful. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit about kind of some of your history. Let's get into a little bit of just the interworkings now of kind of this program that you developed, and what you started researching and finding out, and how that all works. Because as you just mentioned, like we can't compartmentalize. And you mentioned in other talks and teachings that you do that every mental condition has a physical aspect, and every physical condition has a mental aspect, which I also 100% agree, having a holistic approach to health. Can you elaborate on how these conditions actually begin?
Yes. So to pick up on your point about the holistic aspect, the brain and our whole nervous system is like the electrical system. It's like the information flows. The brain is essentially the master conductor, as it were, conducting all of the different instruments. And we even call them instruments or organs of our body and how they operate. Now, if that conductor gets the rhythm wrong, then that's going to affect both our psychology and our physiology and our immunology. It's going to affect everything. The coordination will be disrupted. Whereas mainstream medicine is very what we call reductionist. So mainstream medicine says, if we boil everything down to the smallest degree, and we correct it at the smallest degree, that will be the solution at the broader degree. Yeah. And that's why most of mainstream medicine focuses on the microscopic, on those microscopic chemicals and impacting those. And that's what pharmaceuticals do. Of course, in many situations that is true. But in these modern diseases, as I call them, these neuroimmune conditions, they aren't about the microscopic chemicals. They are more about systems thinking, systems biology. The whole system is disrupted. And the way I look at these conditions, and I'd love to share this story with you. So I would like to start with the biggest question of all: why are we here? And that biggest question is really answered from a scientific perspective. We're here because we've evolved. We've evolved to adapt to our environment, survive, procreate, and pass on our genes to the next generation. So survival is the number one priority of our brain and our body. And therefore, we have evolved over millions of years from plant life right to human beings. We contain the DNA. I love this statistic. We have 40% of the same DNA as a banana, which I find fascinating, that we contain the lineage of all the different plants and animals that have come before us to be able to adapt and survive in our environments. And therefore, we are survival machines. And that gives us a clue as to why we have what we call a negative bias in the brain. So we'll often notice, right, if someone gives us 99 compliments and one criticism, what will we focus on? The brain will focus on the criticism because we are pre-wired for protection and to assess threats so that we can survive. That's an evolutionary advantage. And therefore, when we have illness, and that could be exposure to mold, that could be Lyme, that could be a virus, a bacterial infection, that could be pain. Whenever we're exposed to something that's a threat, our system will always prioritize survival. Now, 99% of the time, our system gets triggered. So we trigger our immune system to fight off, let's say, COVID. We fight it off. We come back to normal. But in some situations, we switch on the nervous system and immune system to fight something off, but it gets traumatized. Just like war veterans come back from a war zone and they feel traumatized by the experience of war, and they keep responding as if the war is on. And in the same way, our brains can keep responding as if we are still under threat. And so that's what then causes a lot of these, what we call neuroimmune conditions. So I want to give an example of this. So I don't know, are you a fan of Game of Thrones?
Yeah, I've watched it before. Yeah.
Well, I always use this analogy in my talks because people find it so useful. But let's take a fairy tale. But for the audience, if you're not a Game of Thrones fan, you can just take a fairy tale. So imagine you are Queen Rachel of your kingdom, and you have an army and a navy. So army is your nervous system, your navy is your immune system, and they defend your kingdom and your castle. Yeah. And imagine now there's a drought in the kingdom. So now the kingdom is weaker, and your army is weaker, your navy is weaker. And in comes an invading army. As I said, it could be pain, mold, Lyme, virus, infections, whatever it is coming over the hill. And normally your army and navy can fight it off, but this time they are actually weaker. So they fight valiantly, but they only just manage to fight off the invaders. That the kingdom nearly fell, nearly succumbed to viruses. And so now the generals come to you, Queen Rachel, and they say, we need all the resources now. Before it was fine, operated at a normal level, but we need all the corn, the wheat, the metal, the strong men and women to come and fight in the army and navy. So now all the resources are being sucked out of the body, just focusing on hyper defense. And those generals are so traumatized that even if a man on a horse comes over the hill, they fire off their cannons and arrows and weapons of war. They become hyper triggered. Then what happens is some of those arrows start falling back in the kingdom. So because those arrows are falling back in the kingdom, that now means that, of course, we get the inflammation in the body itself and the autoimmune effects, because now this outward directed attack is being directed inwards. And the Secret Service that normally got rid of the spies, so that would be opportunistic infections, opportunistic bacterial infections, viruses, etc., those now start flourishing because the Secret Service can't get rid of the spies in the kingdom. So now you have dysbiosis in the gut. The whole system is operating abnormally and a lack of homeostasis. And that's how we see how these conditions start and perpetuate. And not only that, when you have symptoms in your body like fatigue, exhaustion, tiredness, pain, those symptoms loop back to the brain saying, hey, brain, we're still in danger. And the brain thinks, that's right, we're still in danger. Triggers the nervous system and immune system, which creates the symptoms, which double back to a hypersensitive brain. And that's the perpetuation process. Because in most illness, an illness should just stop at a certain point in time. But these illnesses can carry on because they're self-perpetuating and self-triggering, essentially. So yes, that's how we think these diseases start.
Yeah. And I think it's important to know that, because people will say, well, I'm no longer in that stressful situation, or I'm no longer in that environment, for instance, but I'm still having these symptoms. I'm still having these patterns. And it goes back to kind of more or less what you described as there's a chronic cycle here as well, that because of that signal happening for that period of time and going through this cycle, that the brain still thinks you're in that pattern. Is that correct?
That's right. So the brain, as we said, errs on the side of caution, prioritizes survival. So it will always think, well, I'm not sure, but just in case, I will keep engaging that survival mode, as it were. I'll keep defending, even if the virus is no longer present, or the threat is no longer present. And as you say, that's the key thing. We might think, well, I'm not stressed now, so why is this happening? I don't have virus anymore. I don't have mold in my body. Why am I still reacting? The system's trained itself and starts reacting to itself. And that's what we want to correct. And that shows us that our biological systems are very delicate and finely tuned. And if they are buffeted too much by toxins, threats, etc., they can go very easily into these overdrive modes, and that's what we want to correct.
And are there specific areas of the brain that are regulating these things that, are constantly, perpetually in this pattern?
Yes. And we've identified them, hopefully, hypothetically, as the amygdala and the insula. So the amygdala are two almond-shaped structures that sit behind our eyes. And traditionally in psychology, they've been associated with PTSD, emotional responses. But of course, once again, that's medicine trying to differentiate things. Actually, the amygdala is in charge of defensive responses. So fear or anger, they're actually defensive responses to ensure survival. And the amygdala has now been implicated in immune responses and pain responses as well, which makes total sense because the brain does not differentiate like a hospital does. Here's a psychology department. No, there's one organism defending against multiple threats. And therefore, we believe a lot of the conditioning occurs in the amygdala, especially the nervous system conditioning, where those threat responses get into overdrive. And normally we have inhibitory responses. So the brain's very clever. If we're doing too much of one thing, it will counteract it through inhibition so that we maintain balance. But it seems that those inhibition systems no longer operate, and therefore the nervous system stays at heightened alert. And a second brain structure is the insula, which sits between the cortex and the limbic system. And its job is to take in all incoming data from the body, assess threats, and attempt to create homeostasis through the immune system and nervous system. And we believe that that's where the conditioning occurs. And to give an example of this, I find this research really fascinating. So they did research with rats, and the last 20, 30 years, Dr. Paquero Lopez. And what he found was that when you give rats sweet water and an immunosuppressant, naturally the rat's immune system is suppressed because they've got an immunosuppressant. Now you repeat that cycle 4 or 5 times. You give the rats just sweet water by itself, and guess what? The rat's immune systems becomes immunosuppressed. So just like Pavlov's dogs and conditioning, the rats' brains get conditioned that the sweet water represents an immunosuppressant, so it suppresses the immune system. And when they dissect the brain, they find it is the amygdala and the insula that are involved in those primary conditioning effects, not the hypothalamus, though the hypothalamus may be the conduit of those responses.
Sure.
And another one just done recently, which for us is justification of this hypothesis. They took rats and gave them inflammatory bowel disease with a trigger. So they put a carcinogen in the gut, and that triggered inflammatory bowel disease. Then what they did was they measured the electrical signature in the insula, and they then brought the rats back to baseline and just triggered that signature in the brain, just that insular part. And guess what? They were able to create inflammatory bowel disease in the gut.
Wow.
And this is the first time it's been demonstrated on the planet, I believe, where we know that a peripheral reaction, immune reaction in your gut, the information about that then gets stored in the brain ready for next time. And that makes total sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Actually, there must be a central processing system that stores all this vital information to be efficient, ready for the next time we are assaulted by a virus or bacteria, etc. So those are the 2 brain structures involved.
Oh, that's super interesting. And I think it's important to reiterate the fact that you said that when it stores that information, still keep in mind that it still doesn't differentiate a threat. So it could be chemical, it could be physical, it could be emotional, right? It doesn't differentiate.
Well, this is the interesting thing. They say that neurons that fire together wire together. Yeah, very famous phrase in neurology. And what that means is that let's say you're going through a physiological threat, an immunological threat. So let's say you have flu or you have COVID. Now, if you're simultaneously experiencing emotional threats, the brain may tie those 2 experiences together, which is why, and Rachel, I don't know if you experience this in your clinic, and I'm sure you do, sometimes just an emotional experience that a patient is having, let's say they've gone back to baseline, they're healthy, an emotional experience can be enough to re-trigger their mold reactivity or their sensitivities or the chronic fatigue. And that's, leaves practitioners scratching their head saying, well, hang on, I'm treating this at a physiological level, but how is it that an emotion can then re-trigger all of this dysbiosis in the gut and the gut tightening and all the other the negative effects on the body? And that's what it comes down to, that an emotional response can also get stored, which creates the physiological or biological response. And that's what brain retraining is to unpick that so it's separated so that if you do get stressed, that won't trigger your immune system. And that's what brain retraining, or the type of brain retraining we do, actually looks to do.
Yeah, I think most people will say in those circumstances, which may or may not be true, is if something kind of rehashes up in regards to stress that didn't happen for years, it was just in hiding and it came out of hiding. Like that's the typical, I think, mindset that we have, especially with these really tough, like chronic infectious diseases. And they do hide, but I love the perspective of this as well, is that although that may be some part of the fact, there's also this signal in the brain that is just signaling more of the threat. And that's what's continuing this process to happen as well.
Yes, Rachel. And I think it's a both and, as you say, in the sense that once again in medicine we become reductionist to say it's got to be one or the other. And actually it is both and, where we may get the immune system being conditioned to respond. And at the same time, if our immune system is weak, then opportunistic infections and viruses may flourish and may come back into the body. They were hidden and they were being suppressed, but they came back because the immune system is not being efficient and effective. And I think that means that, I think a lot of people don't realize we are constantly being buffeted by infections, right?
Yeah.
There are thousands of bacterial infections, thousands of viruses that are constantly within our bodies, but our immune system does a fantastic job of recognizing them and fighting them off. Yep. But if the immune system is compromised, it can no longer perform that function effectively. Or if it is hyper-focused on something over here, it misses what is over here. That's the thing. So it's like if an army, and people in, different countries are very well aware of this. If we have an army and then we're being attacked on 3 different fronts, it's very difficult to maintain safety. And so if the immune system is hyper focused over here, hyper vigilant, it can miss other opportunistic infections and they can then flourish in the system. And related to that is detoxification. So if we are overstimulating our immune system and nervous system, the natural detox systems get shut down, and therefore all the secondary effects of that can increase.
Yeah. And I think it was the perfect setup a few years ago, with the C word. I guess you've already said it on here, so it's fine to say. But,
we're talking about the same C word.
the censored word. But, so many people are still struggling with long-term effects of that. And when you talk about kind of the setup of that with, chronic fear they were put into, then there is a presence of this new bioweapon, whatever you want to call it. And then they're stuck inside their home and, all of these things. So when you start to piece these things together, which, is what we're talking about, it really is the perfect setup for this hypersensitization that you're explaining, where, and the same I think could be said with like allergies that you talk about. I find that with a lot of patients that, they're coming in and we're talking about allergies and they're avoiding like so many different foods and so many different things. And then, just digging into some of their things. Well, how was life at that time? Like what was going on? What was going on in your home? What was going on in your life? And this is where you see like that multiple trigger of then where the brain just keeps going into that danger zone or survival zone, as you talk about.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's at the time, early in the pandemic, as you can imagine, society was under an existential threat at that time, right? The amount of fear that there was, we were all suddenly isolated in our homes. We weren't socializing. We were being buffeted by all this information from the TV. And of course, that naturally meant that our nervous system and anxiety was heightened, which then created a perfect storm for these conditioning effects to occur in the brain when COVID did come along. We were infected by COVID. And that's why I think there's such a high percentage of people who have long COVID compared to other viruses and infections. Although glandular fever, that also has quite a high percentage of people who have lingering effects. So there is precedent for this. But I think, as you say, mostly when we question patients, when I used to do a lot of one-on-one work, inevitably at the time that the condition started, in the preceding 6 months to a year, they had intense stress, whether it's a bereavement, family stress, work stress often, relationship stress. All of these things build up and make our systems more vulnerable to these conditioning effects.
Yeah. And what is it that exactly happens? Is it that, because of all these stressors, the brain then triggers even the food, for instance, if we're just talking about food as an example, for instance, as also a threat because the brain is just in that mode, or what's like kind of the exact mechanism of how that occurs?
What happens is, and this is, once again, I say this is a hypothesis, but this is what we see time and time again, is that when our system is in its threat survival mode, it is prone to learning defensive responses to otherwise neutral stimuli. And so suddenly when the brain is in this reactive state, it might think, oh, I wonder if that's dangerous for me. Just in case, let me err on the side of caution and let me also be sensitive to that and tell this person to avoid that particular food, wherever it may be. And related to that, there's a middle ground, which is that naturally as human beings, there are certain foods, I believe, that the whole population is pretty much sensitive to, and some people more than others. Let's say lactose, for instance. Let's say gluten, for instance. Now, most of our bodies, when we're healthy and strong and our immune system is strong, we can eat those foods. Our gut may not like it, but it deals with it, let's say, and we're able to have an okay digestion. But then when we're sensitized, those same foods that come into our system that I think the whole population is mildly sensitive to at some level, suddenly those foods reach a threshold where the brain says, no, this is something that is dangerous. We must trigger the immune system and get rid of this because we're in this survival state, which then means that the common, I think it's something like 80% of the common allergens are basically 3 or 4 different foods, which are wheat, wheat and gluten, etc., dairy, eggs, and I think there's another one. And so you see those time and time again because overall the population is slightly sensitive, but when we're ill, we become hypersensitive. The brain is just making a decision. But the problem is we then often remove it from our system completely, which then tells the brain and reinforces to the brain that this is even more dangerous because now we've removed it. And then it becomes even harder to introduce those foods, or even mild amounts of those foods can trigger a reaction. And so it is with mold, right? So we, let's say at one point in our lives may have had 100% exposure to mold, which may well have been a mildly dangerous level of exposure. The body creates a response and says this is dangerous and protects us and attempts to trigger the immune system to fight off those mycotoxins. But then what happens in the future, if it's become traumatized, a 5% exposure creates a 100% reaction.
Yeah.
And then the brain concludes, I was in the presence of 5% of the original triggering event, but look how bad I feel. This clearly is dangerous. And then the brain becomes more and more and more sensitive to more and more minute bits of it, to the point at which someone can have a full-blown anaphylactic shock to a particular bit of food. So we can see how that's trained in the brain. It is just a hyper-defensive reaction to an otherwise neutral substance. And that's why now they're doing trials with children, where children who have nut allergies, they're able to give them minuscule bits of peanut, build it up to train the brain. That's essentially what we're doing. I believe it's training the insular part of the brain. Training the insular part of the brain that those peanuts are not dangerous. Essentially, you don't need to create this massive reactivity and reaction.
Yeah.
And so it is with brain retraining, and the way that we do it is training the brain that mold is safe, our foods are safe, our environment is safe, our body is safe, and then getting us out this loop.
Yeah, that's so powerful because it's specifically for just talking about mold. I mean, mold has become very mainstream now, and for good reason. It's extremely toxic and it can wreak havoc on your body and hormones and all that stuff. But it reiterates the fact of, what I try to coach some of my patients with as well is, hey, yeah, we're going to work on this, but also keep in mind, like, you can't avoid mold for the rest of your life. Like, it is everywhere, especially, I live in near the ocean, and the infrastructure of buildings is pretty terrible as far as air circulation. But additionally, there will be some amount of mold that you will be, under at some point in your life again. So it's getting also their brain out of this fear of, okay, now mold is the enemy and mold is always the enemy. And just like you're talking about these foods and stuff like that. So I think for me, it reiterates the fact that there has to be some of this retraining process as well as, yes, that was extremely toxic load. We're going to work on that. But now your brain is associating every stimulation of mold as being that same effect. And that's kind of what you are explaining, is the brain doesn't differentiate that.
Exactly right. And I think this is the problem, is that we live in a society where X plus Y equals Z. There is mold. I'm having a reaction, get out of mold. And it's not as simple as that. And of course we have, we are very careful about this because, of course, we're not encouraging people to deliberately go into moldy environments. Of course, no. As a natural state, of course, we want to remediate our home if we have high levels of mold. In a very normal environment, normal situations, we would want to reduce that as much as possible. But what we're saying is a combination of, yes, there may be mold around you, but it's the hypersensitivity at the same time. So do the remediation, and we've all got to live in a normal environment. We've got a functional society. And disappearing off into a caravan in Arizona is not going to solve this issue, which is what people do. Right? And they think that that's the solution. They're going to completely dry place. But all that does is further reinforce to your brain that mold is dangerous. So we want to be able to live in the normal world, and knowing that and trusting that our bodies can naturally detoxify from these things. And we have to remember that when we're in that threat mode and we are stimulating our immune system and nervous system because of the anxiety of the environments we're in, we actually, ironically, reduce our body's ability to handle mold. Yeah. So mold is a naturally occurring phenomenon. So I believe that even in generations gone past, there would have been mold around us. We weren't as clean freaks as we are now. There would be mold. We would be exposed to mold, but there would certainly be more air circulation as well, and therefore we weren't living in boxes so much. So that, there's a counterbalance to that. But the body can naturally detoxify these things from our bodies if it's in the right state, and if our immune system is strong, centered, our detox systems are functioning correctly, we can naturally detox.
Yeah, super important. And just going back to the immune system for a second, because I think a lot of people, when they think about the immune system, again, which is not either or, there's a talk of both that we're explaining, but, they think solely of just gut health. And that's because we've done a lot of education on the importance of your gut for good reason, like good versus bad. Bacteria, parasites, all of these different things. But what you're explaining again with the nervous system, it's not just strictly that. It is the brain and the programming and the sensitization that happens as well.
Yes. And it's this both and approach. So we give the analogy of, if you're standing on a bridge and there's a river below you and there's people drowning in the river, you jump in and you save those people from drowning. And, there's somebody else drowning. Quick, jump in, save them from drowning. Set up a rescue center on this bridge to rescue all these people. And that is what's happening in terms of the gut. But nobody's asking the question, who's throwing these people into the river in the first place? We need to walk up the river, go upstream to the source and say, actually, these people are falling into the river because of X, Y, Z reason. So in a similar way, gut dysbiosis is very, very important part of this. And there is a gut-brain axis. So the gut is talking to the brain is talking to the gut. And that's another cycle that can occur. But we believe that it always starts upstream because we have many patients, and I'm sure you do. They get pretty well. They're 80, 90, 100% well. And they don't contact you for maybe months or years. And then suddenly a big stress comes and they say, look, it's back. I'm feeling all this stuff going on. So we believe that the original trigger is the brain, which then gets the gut in an altered state, which then communicates back to the brain that something's wrong and causes more anxiety and depression, which creates more of the stress, and round and around we go. And therefore, it is useful to treat the gut, certainly with the supplements, the medication, etc., but with a both and approach. Let's also treat the nervous system aspects.
Yeah, hugely important. I focus on the nervous system first in my practice, no matter what they come in with, because of these principles that we're talking about. One of those being in a constant state of fight or flight, which is part of that hypersensitization process that you're explaining about. And the list could be quite long as far as what can happen in someone's body with a chronically on alert fight or flight system, or dysfunctional, in a sense, nervous system. What are some of like the top? So I know you have kind of your own experience and then expertise. The list can be extensive, but what are some of like the most, I guess, common things that you guys get in your program, what you've seen the most success with as far as changing some of these patterns and what the outcome has been from that?
Yeah, we've conducted many different scientific studies. So we've done 3 randomized controlled trials so far and 2 clinical audits. And to summarize the results of those things, so we did a clinical audit many years ago, and that showed that 92% of patients improved and 2/3 of patients made a recovery, a full recovery within a year. Now, we define full recovery as 80 to 100% well, because after 80, 85%, you're really now reintroducing yourself back into normal life and normal activities. So that was a published study. And then recently we did a study on fibromyalgia, which showed, some really great results. And that was a randomized controlled trial. And then recently on long COVID as well, we found that our program was 4 times more effective than a wellness program, which was diet, supplements, sleep. It was 4 times more effective at that, at reducing fatigue and exhaustion, and twice as effective at increasing levels of energy. So that was another randomized controlled trial published. And then recently we did a study on 14 different conditions. So this is the first time we ever did something like this. So this was mold, Lyme disease, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, long COVID. And across all the 14 different conditions, and there was no control here, this was 14 within a clinical audit, we found that there was, anywhere between a 50 to 116% reduction in symptoms, or rather increase in functional capacity within 3 months. And so that's also recently been published, in fact, just about a month ago. And that was really incredible because it's showing us that these illnesses all have many, many crossovers. And so does someone have chronic fatigue with Lyme, or if they got Lyme with chronic fatigue? That's what we're trying to pigeonhole these illnesses, but we put them under the banner of neuroimmune conditioned syndromes. So neuro because it's the brain, immune because the immune system's conditioned, conditioning because it's a learned response, and syndrome is because there's a unique collection of symptoms according to each person. So neuroimmune conditioned syndromes. And, I think more and more conditions will fall under those categories. Like we people are now using it for autoimmune conditions and also degenerative diseases like MS, Alzheimer's, where we know there's an inflammatory bias. We know the immune system is attacking healthy cells. Imagine if we could find the formula to switch off that response and get the system back to normal. How amazing and powerful would that be for modern medicine?
Yeah, because we were designed to self-heal, self-regulate. That's how our body was designed to work. I mean, that's the principle of like our chiropractic philosophy, if you could call it, or profession, is that if you have a healthy regulating brain and nervous system, then that's a healthy person because it self-heals, self-regulates, does all of these things as to how it was designed to do. So,
absolutely. Rachel, I share an anecdote. So I have many relatives around the world, and I have some relatives in India, a particular part of India, and they're not particularly well off, right? And so they're living in a village, and they don't have a lot of money, but they have to. They're farmers, so they have to farm. They make their own, grow their own food. They're eating, organically in general. They use obviously some fertilizers. They're outdoors all day. They're in the sunlight. A lot of community. They're laughing, joking every day. They're eating fresh foods, etc. And what amazes me is they're pretty healthy. They're pretty. They don't complain of fatigue. They don't complain about headaches. They can complain about this, that, and the other. They're just getting on with life. And I'm not saying they don't have any health conditions, but I'm thinking, these people have very little resources, and yet look at the way that they're living. And we talk about the blue zones, and, people who live very healthily, what are those characteristics, those 11 characteristics. And I saw that in my family, my extended family. And that shows us that when we're put in the right conditions, we're living according to our genetic inheritance, then actually we can naturally be far more healthy than if we are living in these, modern environments where we're stuck in boxes, we don't get out the light, we don't get the sunlight, we're surrounded by toxins and polluted foods, and we're stressed and staring at screens all day.
Yeah.
What is going to happen? It's a recipe for depression, anxiety, and for illness.
Yeah. Preach. It's just a problem, and I think it's what makes cases so much more complex as well, because very simple as you're finding, as you're researching more and doing all of these things, that, what we would offer, what we would help people with like 20 some years ago, like it's just so much more complex now because there are all these like factors of toxicities and stress and pollution and, all of these things. But what we want to focus and encourage people on is even with all of that, like you're talking about in India, they've got all these different things too. You can still maintain a healthy system, a healthy body by going back to retraining the brain, getting into those environments that, are more optimal for you, and customizing that also for yourself, which I think is super important.
Yes, I think what you've picked up on there is there's the brain retraining to get our system back to normal, but then lifestyle changes that are maintenance that are incredibly important. So for us, the daily relaxation of your nervous system is paramount. In ancient times, they probably didn't need to do meditation because life is very different. Whereas now, it's an absolute must to be able to just survive the modern way of living. And therefore, that regular relaxation, the getting out into nature every week, the eating fresh organic foods as much as possible, reducing junk food and processed foods. so much more important than it would have been in previous generations, because we're being attacked on multiple fronts and the system is on the edge. And I don't know if you noticed this, but I noticed that just in the general population, people are just on the edge. They're just managing, and just some life event can just push them over the edge, and they get anxious, they get depression, they get physical illness. And that's because, and one of the causes of that, I think, is screens. I think with screen time, we no longer give our bodies a rest and our brains a rest. And therefore, the brain is just on the edge of overwhelm and burnout amongst the population.
Yeah, there's so many things neurologically that happen with light, circadian rhythms of light and how it affects our hormones. And, there's so many important aspects of light, and also seasons. Like, seasons, winter time, and that time, many years ago was more of a time to like slow down and work on things and rest. And people are just 100% like all the time, nonstop, go. So all of this stuff is important. And I think I would argue that a majority of people, they aren't really necessarily addressing the programming part of it like we're talking about, or maybe the mental part of it that we're talking about, until they've basically exhausted like every other single form of treatment, physical or emotional in that sense. And I know I see that a lot in my practice, and I focus a lot on teaching and empowering my patients so they don't rely on me. There's instances where they need my help, but my goal is to train them enough so they know. But a lot of people just coming in that are new, they just want out of pain. They want to go back to things. And so they've exhausted kind of all of these things. And then when they get here, I'm like, well, we need to look into what's going on up here. Would you say that something that you've found as well, people coming into your programs, is that they've kind of exhausted all of these other things, and this is kind of like their last fleeting chance of finding something? Or with education and things that are happening, are you seeing them navigate more towards this either initially or midline?
I think in the past, it was the last line of defense. Yeah. So people exhausted all other avenues, and they found us because they were just desperate. And I think now things are changing. So because there's more awareness of brain retraining in general, people are coming to us earlier in the cycle of their condition, which is great, because the longer you leave the conditioning, the more deep conditioning occurs in the brain. The longer it's had that learning.
Yeah.
And I think things are changing. And for us, what matters is the clinical research, because if we do the research, if we show this in larger and larger scale trials, we want to do phase 3 trials, then that finally proves it to the medical profession. And then we can get people right at the start. So imagine a scenario where people get diagnosed with long COVID or mold, and straight away the first port of call is brain retraining. And in that way, then I don't think it's, and I'm not being dogmatic, it may be brain retraining combined with some kind of supplementation and physical therapies as well. But that combination could be then really powerful, and people get that up front versus the last thing. And that's our aim. And that's why we've even set up a chronic conditions research fund, which is a 501c3 compliant fund in the US, to get donors to donate to that. And they can obviously get tax benefits. And then we use that money to run clinical trials. And that's our real priority right now, is the proof of this. And the studies that we've done recently have been great, because just publishing randomized controlled trials has really got a lot more, certainly IFM doctors, nutritionists, naturopaths on board that previously wouldn't have been, because it was still speculative. So I think that's our vision and aim.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because, well, a lot of those practitioners too, I'm not like conditioning all of them, but a lot of them, because I was in this boat for a long time too, you're very like just science minded, and so the availability for your brain to think in different ways and think because sometimes things can't be measured, but for them to go into that place and be like, no, we've actually measured this as well. I think that is such a huge portion for that field, because being so science minded and driven, it will begin to help like massively produce more mindsets that, okay, we have the research. So now we know we can use some of these things as well. And I think that's going to be super important for that category of physicians as well.
Yeah. I think there's a phrase that I'm trying to remember now. It's something like sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's what it can feel like, that sometimes, well, this brain thing, it sounds like woo-woo. It sounds, ridiculous. And therefore we're going to just ignore it and focus on what we can measure and what is scientific. And actually what we're saying is the reason this doesn't come to the forefront is because the brain has always been this black box. We didn't know what on earth was going on in the brain. So modern medicine, or traditional medicine, focus on what we can measure. Well, we can measure hormones, and we can measure all these things going on in the body. But the brain, we can't really measure that. And it's only recently, as we get more brain scanning information coming in, that we can say, actually, we can see that could it be lots of illnesses and their root origins could be in the brain. Certainly these modern inflammatory diseases and autoimmune diseases that so many people are suffering from. And therefore, it then becomes more scientific because it's opening up a new area of the body that we didn't really understand. And therefore, for us now, brain retraining, neuroplasticity is very, very scientific and very measurable. In fact, we can see that's what we want to do in future studies, is measure the impact on the brain, measure inflammatory markers, and show objectively that this is having an impact as well.
Yeah, super important. I think your trajectory is so similar to like the chiropractic profession, because people just would call us crazy, and like there's all these things that happen, and how are you getting this? It's woo-woo, it's magic, whatever you want to say. But now, similarly as well, we have a lot of research and international that does the same thing. So, research is sometimes slow in catching up to, what we're finding out. So don't let that like limit you from what you're doing, but also it is super important to have the research and backing. Now, there's lots of, or not a lot, but there are some other brain retraining programs out there that are available. So what is specifically I guess you could say different or cumulative of what you incorporate that makes your program so successful?
Sure. And I think people aren't aware of this because sometimes we get asked, did you guys come after these other brain retraining programs? What people aren't aware of is that I started this work in terms of seeing patients in 2001 at my clinic in Harley Street in London. And that's where I really started this type of brain retraining work. So we are the first, neuroplasticity brain retraining program that came along. And we were the first to publish our treatment as a DVD program in 2007. And since then, there have been many other programs that have come along, and, there have been certain ones that have, let's say, taken inspiration from our work. And that's fine. That as long as people, there's many more people out there helping others, and that's what matters. But we, differentiate ourselves through the amount of research that we've done on this. So we're the only ones that have randomized controlled trials showing effectiveness. And also, I feel that some of these other approaches have kind of taken some of the essence away of what we were doing, which was to have a more compassionate approach. So some of these things can be like a boot camp that just keep retraining, do this. And if it's not working because you're not doing it enough, it puts the blame on the patient. And that can make things worse. Whereas actually it's a holistic approach and a broad ranging approach. So we do want to treat the whole organism, not just this one thing, do this one thing and that's it. And having multiple tools there as well. And I think that compassionate approach, together with the fact that we're one of the only ones that's an app, right? So I think it's so much easier to use an app than it is, a member area or whatever on the website. So that's a good game changer. But the real game changer for us has been the daily Gupta Size. Now, daily Gupta Size, as we know with neuroplasticity, it is a repetition practice. So daily Gupta Size are daily Zoom calls which do the nervous system regulation and the brain retraining. And they're on Zoom with one of our practitioners, and we have like 200 to 300 people joining a day.
Wow.
And that's a game changer for many patients because they get the regularity, they get the motivation, they get the novelty factor every day, and they get the accountability. And they're loving it. And it's, people who are taking months and months and months to heal, just coming on Gupta Size every day has really been the game changer. The understanding is profound. And that is something that we do, completely unique. We're the only program that does something like that. And it's really making a great difference.
Is that addition to, so for instance, would people coming in do that in addition to like the videos and series that you have? Is that like an addition, or is that a whole separate program in itself?
We've included it for free within the program. So if somebody buys our normal program, they get those daily sessions for free included. Yeah. So we have the videos and the audios, and then we have the weekly webinars with myself, and then we have the daily Gupta Size. And of course, we have 30 to 40 coaches around the world that can treat people one-on-one as well. So there's a whole ecosystem and infrastructure that supports patients through their journey.
Yeah, and the videos themselves are quite extraordinary. I mean, it's probably a bit of your filmmaking background, but they're beautiful. They're like these beautiful landscapes. And I'm sure that is very intentional as far as what you're doing with retraining the brain as well. What is that exactly achieving?
Yeah, it's what we call transmission. Now you're getting into our secrets here. We'll share our secrets. So what this means is that when people have nervous system dysregulation, what needs to be modeled for them is relaxation, calm, what we call a loving, wise self. So if someone comes into a practitioner's practice and the practitioner's all, ruffled and stressed out and whatever, that isn't going to help the patient. All that's going to do is dysregulate them further. So our videos are deliberately designed to be soft, warm, welcoming. I talk slowly. I explain everything, which naturally people's nervous system just calms down just through watching those videos and the beautiful landscapes. So it's therapeutic in and of itself to watch those videos, and that's by design. And some people, it's really funny because some people who have very dysregulated nervous systems, they say, Ashok, you talk too slowly, and they start watching the videos at higher speed just so that they can match their own nervous system. Which is hilarious. But, whatever works for people, I don't mind. But that is the purpose of why we spent a lot of time and money filming those videos in the south of Spain, but mainly in Switzerland. So most of the videos were filmed in the healing mountains of Switzerland. And it was a very fun, enjoyable month in Switzerland filming it, because I could feel what I was experiencing in that nature, and I wanted to transmit that through the camera, through my voice, through my the way I was speaking, those gestures to transmit that relaxation.
I think it's super evident in your videos. You did an excellent job. I'm sure you already know that, but it's not only beautiful, but the tone, the voice, all of that, it matters. And I think it's funny when you give that example because, we get the same exact people in here sometimes that are like, running on fumes or in here and you can just sense like their system is just so overloaded. And I'm not like that at all. Like I'm very calm, collected, no matter what's going on, there's going to be a resolution some way. So, and you just watch them slowly over time. Like, man, I just walk into your office and it's so peaceful. I'm like, well, yeah, you've intentionally done that, but also, you don't have to live your life in that specific way. So, I appreciate that when I watch some of those videos as well, because it does personify nature and the healing effects of what creation does for us. And, you kind of get that all, even though it's a screen, you still get a sense of that. And so it was really, really well done.
Yeah.
So I know you're working on some new research stuff. What's on the horizon for, your programs? What are you envisioning to come as far as, what's next?
I think for us, it's, as we mentioned, the research. So having more research studies coming out and fundraising. So we are fundraising at the moment so that we can fund a lot of these studies. And I think it's sad, isn't it, that actually, if you want to, drug trials, medical trials is, funding for that kind of thing. And although those can be very complex as well, but actually for this type of work, there's very little funding available and the system isn't set up to fund these types of things, which is disappointing really, because now we should be looking beyond the existing pharmaceutical approach because we clearly have shown that doesn't work. So I think that's the future for us, is more and more research. And I think secondly, what we're very interested in is helping practitioners understand our program so they can recommend it to their patients now that we have some evidence. And therefore, we offer free access to anyone who's a practicing clinician who's seeing patients. We give them free access to our program so they can experience it for themselves. They can see the benefits. They can watch the videos. And then, of course, they can then make a more informed decision to decide which of their patients could benefit from this approach. And when practitioners do that, what they tell us is that they feel so empowered that because they're giving people a combination of treatments, they're not just doing their one piece of the jigsaw, but they're giving a more holistic approach. So we take care of for them the nervous system and the brain, and they can focus on the supplements and the medications and the other things, pieces of the jigsaw. And it's just a really great integrated synergistic approach. And therefore the practitioners feel good because they see the improvements, and they see the magnification of those improvements by combining both approaches. And that for us is great. And that's what we want to educate practitioners, that you can get better outcomes for your patients and longer term sustainable outcomes when you combine.
Yeah. And that's important because we practitioners can't do everything. We can try, but we can't do everything. So having resources like this is super important. Is it all on your website as far as for helping with the research funding and then signing up as well? Is it all just on your website?
Absolutely, yes. So people can, if they want to donate, they can go to guptaprogram.com/donate. But in terms of just wanting to be interested in taking our free trial and watching the videos, they can just go to our website, guptaprogram.com, or they can go to App Store or Play Store, type in Gupta Program, Brain Retraining, and then the Gupta Program app is there as well.
Amazing. Well, this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening there where you are currently. And I know that this is going to help a lot of people. So thank you for your time, not only where they're at, but preventatively knowing this information is empowering, is powerful to know that you can change, your situation. Even if you're living in a situation that you feel like is toxic, you can still do something about it. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. We truly appreciate you. We appreciate all that you're doing, your calling on your life and what's going forth through this program. So we thank you again for your time.
No, very kind of you, Rachel. And it's been a lovely interview. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, we will catch all of you guys on the next episode. Thanks for watching.